Alright, so Macroeconomics, lecture 24. We continue with the bust. Before we get to the bust, there is that section or short period of time called the crisis. So the crisis is essentially that transition period. It's a very short period of time where corporate profitability suddenly turns into losses. So suddenly most businesses begin to turn losses. It usually happens in a matter of months. So crisis is a short period of time right after the boom where businesses suddenly experience a loss of profitability, and usually actually is associated with major corporate losses. Alright, so crisis. Now we get to depression, which is equivalent to bust. First of all, let's try to provide some bigger causes. We have covered these one way or another. Number cause. Cause one is overconsumption. Of course, overconsumption by itself is not the problem. The problem is that overconsumption in economics is equivalent to undersaving. So a shortage or scarcity of savings is one of the fundamental causes. Now, there is kind of like a cause number two, which is a result of the credit expansion, and this is an over-investment in capital goods. Remember, I was usually denoting them as high order capital goods. And here is the trick. Simultaneously with underinvestment in consumer goods. Consumer goods, let's remind again, I've been using at least throughout this course for a while, low order capital goods. Now, these two things together, we usually called malstructuring of the economy. So, it was an economic malstructuring. Kind of like as I've been giving examples so far, we will in Bulgaria produce too much real estate, too many houses, too many hotels, and too few consumer goods. In our case, we import them all. So, malstructuring of the economy. A different way of saying the same thing is that some sectors are too big and some sectors are too small. And malstructuring the economy has a very special type. It overinvests in capital goods, which we kind of like call future goods, and underinvests in present goods, which is kind of like current consumption. So we call this process coordination or temporal coordination. So producing too much of the one and too little of the other is effectively the same thing as temporal discoordination. In Bulgaria, we will have houses and real estate for the next 5 generations, effectively. But we don't produce many consumer goods like gasoline. Alright, let's see. And of course, cause number 3, by now in this course, it is trivial. This is mass or massive entrepreneurial errors. Hotels. Whole Black Sea has, spotted a hotel next to a hotel next to a hotel, a couple of thousand hotels, in the erroneous belief that all Westerners, Western Europeans will be coming to, our hotels. Well, once the boom is over and the bust or depression begins in earnest, most entrepreneurs will realize that they were mistaken. Alright, so this is an example of mass entrepreneurial error. So these are the 3 causes. Now, I have a long list of consequences. In other words, so what does the bust mean? Let's see how I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this like this. Consequences. Again, draw the line. And I have kind of like a dozen, which I'll be explaining. Number 1. As our bankers will learn very soon, as well as American bankers are learning now as the credit crunch and the bust has been going on, is that usually in the early and special late stages of the bust, entrepreneurs or businesses are unable to service bank debts. So, inability to service debt. Now, what you got to understand is that this is a necessary feature of a bust. I'm going to be getting some more of it. In other words, if people are still able to service bank credit, then it is not truly, really yet a bust. So, bust means a lot of businesses already are experiencing serious problems. This answers partially your question about our Bulgarian bust. Bulgarian, both corporations and individuals are still serving their debt fairly well. Delinquency rate, which is the percentage of people that cannot service their debts, has risen somewhat, but is still up to now within tolerable levels. So we do not have yet major problems. In other words, we may be somewhere in the crisis, and we are in the early stages of the bust or moving in that direction. Number 2, massive bankruptcies. This is very typical of a bust. It is a necessary feature of a bust. In other words, the boom was the time of malinvestments. People invested in stuff that turns out to be non-profitable. The bankruptcy means that whatever was a bad investment must necessarily be liquidated. What does liquidate mean? Liquidate means that the asset is sold out, typically on an auction, to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder will buy it and will put the asset into a better use. In other words, the process of bankruptcy and liquidation is associated with a shifting back or reshuffling resources to better, more economic uses, as that massive bankruptcies are a basic requirement for a bust. It also means that as long as the government does not allow bankruptcies to occur, usually they only lengthen or prolong the depression. Number, 3, general pessimism. So pessimism, and the other word which is typically used in English is demoralization. So pessimism is the alternative word for depression. Depression actually comes because, one, the economy itself was depressed, but two, alternatively, people felt depressed during the depression. So part of the depression that people felt is that they are, or they feel, very pessimistic about the economy and about the prospects of the economy within, the near-term future. They also feel demoralized. This is very typical, was highly typical during the Great Depression, where people were very pessimistic, very depressed. The depression went on for almost 10 years, and at some point Americans even began to believe that maybe they will never ever get out of the depression. Of course, I don't want to get into the details of how and why they got, but that's very typical. 1970s was a very lengthy bust. It started in late 60s, went all the way to 1982. It had a number of intervening mini booms within the bust, from like 71 to 73 was a mini boom. 73, 74 was a bust period. Then 74, well, let's say 75 to 79 was another boom, mini boom. Then 79 through 81 was a bust. 81, 82 was another mini boom, and then another bust. So the point is that within all of these hard times, these were the so-called stagflationary 70s that went on for well over 10 years, close to 15 years. And here's another key. The stock market didn't move any higher in 15 years. People began to feel very pessimistic about the prospects of America. Again, that's very typical in a bust. Next is forced unemployment. This, of course, is one of the most grossly misunderstood topics in a bust. The unemployment simply means that people that were used in whatever was overinvested, for example, real estate, like real estate brokers, construction workers and whatnot, they left unemployed. This simply means that they're going to be looking for some job, and over time, maybe within a week, maybe within a month, or a year, possibly two, they will find some other job. And that other job will be, hopefully or preferably, in an industry where there has been underinvestment. In other words, the unemployment and forcing people to become unemployed is a welcome phenomenon in a bust, where overemployment in certain sectors is reduced and labor is shifted to other sectors where there is a scarcity of employment. Let's provide examples. The one, of course, I already gave you. In America, 1 million real estate brokers. Does America need 1 million real estate brokers? What about mortgage brokers? These are the guys that, will give you a loan for $250,000. You sign the paper and you're forever in debt to the bank. Does America need 1 million mortgage brokers? All right, so America has extreme overemployment in the real estate and the associated industries. And of course, these people aren't producing way too much. Well, they were during the boom. But now America's got problems. Not enough petroleum. Not enough petroleum engineers. Not enough rigs to dig for oil. Go deep in the ground for oil. So, too few resources associated with the oil industry. Too few resources associated with the gas industry. Too few resources with wheat. I just sent you an article on shortages of rice. In modern days, we're talking about April 2008, shortages of rice in America should sound extraordinarily absurd. But they are the American reality today. The April 2008. You have, you want to go and buy in the store, you got a whole bunch of money, they say a limit of 4 bags. Again, what is the fundamental problem? Fundamental problem is too many millions of Americans are working as mortgage brokers and real estate brokers, and not enough people working to produce rice. Not enough people to produce wheat. Now, you got this ethanol thing, right? Where, they're using ethanol. Well, what is the problem with ethanol? The problem is not with ethanol using it as a fuel. The problem is insufficient crude oil and natural gas production to power cars, and then you use corn, to fuel cars. Well, there you have the problem. So, underinvestment, as I explained in some of these areas, simply means that these mortgage brokers better go unemployed and better get back to the farm, or better begin engineer cars that are so much more efficient, because otherwise the economy will remain malstructured and won't get out of its own problems, whatever they are. Alright, so is this fairly understood? So the idea of forced unemployment is shifting labor resources back to their better uses. It is the same as number 2, but in number 2 the bankruptcy means shifting capital resources to their better use. Okay? Let's see now. Number 5, it would happen that highly specific capital goods will be abandoned. For example, we in Bulgaria believed, and maybe still some do believe, that all Europeans will be coming to ski in Bulgaria. So we're building a whole bunch of ski lifts. Well, foreigners, that ski in Bulgaria did not show up this winter in masses, at least as our entrepreneurs believed. In other words, we had a massive entrepreneurial errors of overbuilding in ski lift. Well, ski lift would be representing highly specific capital goods, which you just can't easily convert into anything else. If it's crude oil, you can convert it to gasoline. Great. Well, if you don't need a gasoline, you can convert it into diesel. That's okay. If not, you can use it for engine oil. You can use it for a whole bunch of things. But a ski lift cannot be used for much or anything else. High up there in the mountain where nobody lives, no one wants to live, and of course tourists aren't just coming to ski. So, when that happens, assets will be abandoned. Now, the act of abandoning simply means that a scarce resource was wasted completely. This is one of the key characteristics of a boom, is that some malinvestments will be ultimately completely abandoned and will result in pure waste. You create the resource, and then that resource is used for nothing, and most likely will not be used for many decades. So that is what is one of the fundamental problems with the boom. This is not a cause, this is just a result. Malinvestment of resources which eventually are abandoned and result in pure waste. 6. General impoverishment of the society. Well, the bust, you gotta understand, results in a whole bunch of things, all bad. Number one is huge unemployment. A lot of people lose jobs, they don't get any income. What else is really bad during the bust is that consumer prices rise faster than incomes, faster than wages. In other words, part of the impoverishment is a relative fall in real wages, or relative fall in the purchasing power of wages. Well, that's pretty bad on top of the unemployment. If this is not bad enough, one of the major characteristics of a bust, if you would remember, during the boom, capital asset prices went up, kind of like stock market was going up, real estate market was going up. During the bust, the exact opposite occurs. Real estate prices go down, so suddenly people's houses are worth a lot less than they thought or than they were a year ago. And their stocks and investments, or whatever retirement portfolio, whatever they have investments in, they go down. In other words, assets that people own, sometimes we just call them investments, go down, so they get poorer because of that. And on the other hand, everything they consume, consumer goods, bread, wheat, gasoline, whatever, goes up. So it is a double hit on consumer, which definitely results in clear impoverishment of overall for the society. Of course, during a bust, there are always skillful, smart, sharp people who are able to use the bust to their benefit, meaning they are good entrepreneurs, they see opportunities in a bust, and they do make money, possibly a lot of money. But overall, for the society, it is impoverishment. All right, any questions so far? Is it very clear? Let's see. Reduced productivity of labor. So, labor productivity falls. Well, why would labor productivity fall? Well, the answer is fairly straightforward. There is not enough demand. During the Depression, general or overall demand is low. Well, why would demand be low? The answer is, during the boom and during the credit expansion, there was excess demand. Let's put it differently. There was overconsumption and undersaving. During the bust, the opposite must necessarily occur. People must begin to consume less and must begin to save more. So suddenly we're all 35 professors in here, but we were hoping for 250 students to enroll, but now in the early stages of a bust, we got barely 150. So rather than have 4 courses per professor, we might have 3 courses per professor, for example. So, in general, because business is slow, but someone's got to do the work, that person will be less productive. For example, you got a business, it makes, let's say, 2,000 transactions during a normal year. Now, during the bust, it makes barely 1,000 transactions. Before, you had one accountant accounting for these 2,000 transactions and squaring the books. Now, you got, of course, you must have again one accountant, but that accounting is doing only half the work. Well, that same person doing only half the work is kind of like productivity falls in half, okay? So, in general, there is what would be understood as underemployment of labor. Well, essentially what happens is the economy transitions where other sectors that were fairly weak, for example, now in Bulgaria, hey, rice prices have doubled, people will shift to produce rice. But the problem is, prices went up January through March. You can get people on rice, you know, when the season comes. You can't get them in February because prices went up in February, right? You got to see the trend is there, you got to see the prices are stable, and only then people will begin to shift or transition. In other words, the small demand or less demand, especially in those industries that were overinvested, will result in underemployment specifically of labor, but also in capital. And the same amount of labor and the same amount of capital will be producing less, which is mathematically equivalent or definitionally results in lower productivity, labor. Well, of course, it applies to capital too. Number 8 is the next one. It is fairly straightforward. Real wages fall. We have discussed this. Turns out that prices rise faster than wages during the bust, but it is also possible that wages fall faster than prices. Again, depending on the type of bust. But in either case, one thing is certain. During the bust, you have falling real wages. Again, this is part of the overall impoverishment of society. Let's see what else we got. Crisis of confidence is something that banks typically learn during the crisis, and especially during the crisis of confidence. Why would people lose confidence? Because everything is going bad. Businesses can't service debt, individuals, families can't service debt. Suddenly you get a whole wave of bankruptcies. People feel bad, pessimistic about the economy. You see a lot of unemployed. You see overall impoverishment, productivity falls. So people begin to lose confidence. They begin to lose confidence in the future. We call it pessimism. But they also begin to lose confidence in the financial and banking system. And the result of loss of confidence is, how did we call it, guys?
Bank run.
That's the bonus point. Bank run. You kind of like get two today. Bank runs. Yes. Classic example during a depression is a possibly wave of bank runs. Well, we saw during this course a bank run on Northern Rock. Okay, there was a bank run, classic bank run in the United States of Countrywide, which was a mortgage banker. There was an atypical modern classic, not classic bank run of Bear Stearns. Now, customers just withdrawing billions in a matter of hours. Bear Stearns is bankrupt due to a classic bank run. So, these are beginning. Well, back to your question at the beginning of the lecture, before the lecture is, in Bulgaria we have not had yet bank runs, but these are, rest assured, coming, right? That's what the typical consequences are. It will be extremely rare not to observe in a bust any of these. These are pretty much assured. Of course, it may take 2, 3, 4 years to, to get all the effects and consequences in force, but whatever it takes, it's got to happen. And number 10, I'm going to use, this is the one, which is the last one. It is called credit crunch. Sometimes also known or called as credit squeeze. Are you zooming in good? All right, credit squeeze. Interestingly enough, these are actually lecture notes which I prepared kind of like 2 years ago when I did money in banking and an old macroeconomics course. And credit crunch, credit squeeze, also possibly credit contraction. Contraction, of course, is the opposite word of expansion. Now that lecture, when I was lecturing it last year, guys are coming back and saying, wow, guys, you got to watch this lecture. That was the lecture on the bust, which was also recorded. They say, look at what this guy is saying about these typical consequences. And guess what? They are beginning one by one to materialize today in the US economy. So I was teaching about credit crunch and credit crisis and credit squeeze and, of course, a loss of confidence. Sometimes we call it crisis of confidence. And now, since August, as the credit crunch, or let's call it subprime crisis, has begun in earnest, people get to realize, oh, this was actually well described. And it was easily forecastable. It's just that nobody told us about it. So, very typical credit crunch. So what is a credit crunch? A credit crunch is the desire, possibly, of borrowers to borrow more, but at the same time, banks are unwilling to lend. Why banks will be unwilling to lend? The answer is fairly straightforward. Due to already large bankruptcies and other losses, credit losses, banks running losses means that they lose capital. So, capital of banks, which is the equity of a commercial bank, shrinks, and therefore the bank has less capital, or what we call capital base, to expand credit on top of it. So, if the bank balance sheet is that big and capital shrinks in half, this means that the leverage has practically doubled. So, commercial bank doubles its leverage, its risk usually rises substantially. At that point, the bank must do one of two things, or possibly a combination. It must increase its capital. We call this recapitalization. So recapitalization is the process of raising bank capital after banking or the credit losses have been incurred in order to reinstall its former leverage ratio, its former liabilities to capital ratio. So that's one way to restore the ratio. The other way, besides recapitalization, is a classic, I should have written it here, you've got to put it in there, credit contraction. In other words, credit contraction for a commercial bank is ceasing to give new credits. So the bank stops lending. At the same time, it only collects payments for all debts. And if it has outstanding loans, which are demand loans, remember, just like depositors have demand deposits, occasionally banks will provide loans with the stipulation that they can call the loan at any time. To call a loan means that a bank demands from its borrower to repay the loan back in full. So sometimes banks will provide callable loans. This means that when a bank gets in trouble, it calls the customer, the borrower says, please pay back immediately per our contract. So the alternative is either to recapitalize, which is to increase the capital, or to shrink the balance sheet. To shrink the balance sheet means to reduce the liabilities by paying, getting cash back and not re-lending the money and using the cash to pay down liabilities. So, any questions before I move on to other things? So, I'm done with the basic consequences. Questions? Any? No? Is it clear? Alright, let's move on then. Next point. Necessary features of a bust. Necessary features of a bust. So, why are these features important? And the short answer is because they're necessary. What does necessary mean? It means you must see the feature, you must be able to check market, and only then you can declare that the bust is over. So, we'll provide also an examples with the theory. First necessary feature of a bust is rising interest rates. Remember, during the boom and during the credit expansion itself forced interest rates below the market clearing rate. Well, in order, that also caused intertemporal discoordination. In order to reshuffle back the resources, it must be that interest rates rise, and most often, if you would remember, they would even rise higher than before the boom began. Rising of interest rates is necessary in order to rebalance the pricing between capital goods and consumer goods. In other words, rising interest rates will force stock market prices, real estate prices, and all capital goods prices much lower. Alright? If it forces them much lower, only then they will become unprofitable and there will be shifting of the resources back to low order goods. So this is an absolutely necessary feature of a bust. Remember, a lot of the boom began in the first place because the credit expansion forced interest rates lower. So you have to see this for a while in order to be sure that it will readjust the economy. Number two is straightforward. So far, liquidations. Liquidations, again, I will repeat, means the sale of an asset, typically a capital asset, and to the highest bidder, and most likely its conversion to possibly some other use. For example, the little retail store, doesn't sell well, it's sold to somebody else, and you make it a dental office, or make it an attorney office, or make something else, anything else. Whatever will be more profitable, alright? Well, how do we know it will be more profitable? Well, the answer is the auctioning process. You say, hey, this is for sale. If it is for sale, whoever is able to bid the highest will also mean that that buyer will also be able to make most profit out of it. Well, what does it mean, most profit out of something? It means he will be able to put it in its best economic, in the most profitable, in the most efficient way. So remember, profitability equates with efficiency. High efficiency results in high profitability. High profitability guarantees high efficiency. So the liquidation through an auction necessarily means shifting the resource to a better, more productive use. Alright? 3. The prices of high order capital goods must fall. So, prices, here's I'm going to use this trick. Prices, remember, high order capital goods, okay? Now I'm going to take the ratio, meaning relative to low order capital goods. So I'm going to take ratio of prices to low order capital goods and high order capital goods, or capital goods versus consumer goods. The ratio must fall. So I'm just going to put in an arrow down. It means one of a few things. It means that either capital goods prices must fall, or it means that consumer prices must go up, or it means a combination of the two. It's possible that capital goods prices rise, but these rise faster. It could mean that consumer goods prices fall, and these fall faster. But it must be that the relative prices change and they fall. Okay? Is that fairly clear? I'm going to be explaining a little bit more about it. And finally is that general concept of reallocation of resources. Let me repeat the meaning of resources. When I say resources, at least in this course, I mean productive resources. So I mean labor, capital, land. So reallocation means, if you would remember, during the early stages of the boom, resources were shifted from low order to high order. Well, the meaning of the bust is to shift them from high order back to low order. In other words, they were shifted to less productive use. Well, it was less productive because it didn't fit the demand pattern of consumers. And now it's got to get back to normal. So, these four are the necessary features of a bust. So, I just published a couple of, months ago, an article about Japan, Japanese economy. The Japanese economy is going to be slipping again into a recession. During the 1980s, the Japanese economy was booming, going higher and higher and higher and higher. Of course, they kept interest rates lower. Japanese stock market, the Nikkei, went up, let's call it 10 times. Real estate prices kind of like went up 10 times. So there's a wild and crazy boom, ending with a wild and crazy real estate bubble that burst in 1990. So 10 years boom, busted in the crisis was 1990, and then the economy slipped into a bust or recession. So there was a recession, the government reflated madly, and 2 years later they declared, well, the Japanese depression is over, we are back to normal. Well, it wasn't back to normal because interest rates didn't go up during the bust. Japanese did not allow liquidations to occur. Stock market had fallen relatively little, real estate prices had fallen also relatively little, and consumer prices didn't adjust much, and there hasn't been much reallocation of resources. The point is that for the 2 years of a bust, none of the necessary features were satisfied. So, what's the logical conclusion? Well, the government reflated the economy. The economy was astonishingly weak. Everyone was surprised, or actually wondering, baffled, why the Japanese economy is so weak? And a year or 2 years later, the Japanese economy slipped again into a recession. In other words, the bust reasserted itself in full force. Well, the Japanese government again intervened. It did not allow any of these four to occur. Well, it doesn't allow because they are painful, socially painful, and especially politically painful. So again, a year or 2 years later, the Japanese economy began a feeble recovery. And guess what? It didn't last long. So they slipped again into a recession. In other words, what you have now for 18 years in a row, from 1990 up until 2008, the Japanese economy has been in a bust, and over the last 3 years, the Japanese economy started to grow a little bit, and everybody declared that the Japanese, what they call malaise, is over, while in reality, we did not observe any of these again. Of course, the stock market has fallen quite a bit, like 4 times or so. Real estate prices have fallen like 3 times or so. But again, not enough to readjust the pricing in the economy. And suddenly, now in 2008, most economists in the world are baffled as to why the Japanese economy is once again slipping into a recession. And the answer, of course, is for 18 years in a row, these have not been satisfied. Partially number 3, no number 1, no number 2, practically no number 4, and everyone is baffled. Well, there is no mystery into Japan's latest slipping into a recession again. Now, we can get into the US bust and see that none of these has even begun to be satisfied now in order to declare that the US economy is bottoming out and soon to get back to normal. So, the typical way to analyze an economy is to check to see how well these necessary features of a bust are satisfied. If they are well satisfied, then you can declare the bust over, and you can declare the economy to be healthy and ready to grow, or to be reinflated for another boom-bust cycle. Is this now fairly clear? Does it make sense? All right. Moving on. Next topic. Types of bust. As is now in 2008, well, it has been for the last, I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, the big hot topic in the US has been whether the US bust will be inflationary or deflationary in nature. So, number 1, a bust, classic bust, is deflationary. A deflationary bust is a bust where an actual contraction of money supply occurs. So, let me put it in here. There is a credit contraction which itself results in money supply going down. We have a name for money supply going down. We call it
deflation.
Deflation. And therefore, the bust is deflationary. This is the classic bust which has occurred most throughout history. That's because mostly money has been gold and silver, and therefore governments have not been able to, here's a key word, reflate the economy. So there is another time, let's call it, I'm going to skip in here for 2 minutes, be patient, I will be explaining now. Inflationary. In other words, remember one of the key features which I was explaining early on during the boom is that credit must expand, but if you're going to maintain the boom, it must necessarily expand at an accelerating rate. So it grows at 20%, then it's got to grow at 25, then it's got to grow at 30. Well, an inflationary bust would mean that credit grows, but grows at a decelerating rate. So it grows at 30%. Now the economy is expecting 30% growth again, or maybe 35%, but it gets barely 20% growth of money supply and credit. What does it mean? Everyone demands and wants 30%, but you supply on the market 20%. What is the result? Interest rates will necessarily rise. Second, you're not having enough credit and capital to feed capital, meaning the stock market and real estate, so there will be some readjustment. You're expecting 35 to feed the boom, but you get only 20%, so there will be some liquidations. In other words, if the banking, the credit system does not supply sufficiently high credit, it will trigger bust features even though inflation continues. So you will get an inflationary bust. In other words, you still have credit expansion, you still have inflation, but it is not enough to feed the boom, and it triggers, if you would remember the 5 reversal processes from last time, it begins to trigger many or most of these consequences. Alright? So you can get an inflationary bust. And there is one which is kind of like in between the two of them. It is a fairly modern theoretical development. Of course, we have observed it throughout the 70s. It is called stagflationary. Stagflationary bust. And stagflationary bust is a bust where the government viciously fights deflationary forces. It is able to inflate some, of course insufficiently, and the result in a stagflationary bust is the following classic combination. Prices of high order capital goods fall a little bit, and the prices of low order capital goods rise. Alright, is this making sense? In other words, real estate prices fall or fall some. Well, they may rise a little. Stock market lingers, but consumer inflation is raging big time. In an inflationary bust, what you will get is the prices of high order capital goods rise, and the prices of consumer goods rise, but rise a lot faster. That is why for prices of capital goods I put an arrow up, and for consumer goods I put 2 arrows up, rising a lot faster, at a faster rate. Okay? And in a deflationary bust, let me wipe this off. In a deflationary bust, what you get is the following. Deflationary bust, consumer prices, low order capital goods fall. We call this consumer deflation, but at the same time prices of high order capital goods fall a whole lot more. So, consumer prices during the Great Depression fell maybe 2 or 3 times, maybe in half. But at the same time, stock market fell 10, 15 times. Real estate prices fell 10 times. Alright? So, the idea is that this readjustment, this falls a lot more than this, is, let me provide an arrow, consistent with this ratio. This is also consistent with this ratio. And this is also consistent with this ratio. So the key again is whether it's deflationary, stagflationary, or inflationary, the ultimate result must be the necessary readjustment of capital goods to consumer goods. Alright? Which of the three outcomes occurs depends strictly on government monetary and fiscal policy. If they fight the bust viciously, they will get a stagflationary bust, and if they are viciously fighting and successful, they can get an inflationary bust. If they are not fighting strong enough, they will, or deflation will take over and a deflationary bust will occur. Typically, what happens is deflationary bust takes over. These processes kick in real fast. They become extremely painful. Government says, no way, we cannot allow these to go on. They viciously reinflate. They kick in a stagflationary bust, or maybe they can reinflate so much that they can re-engineer a little mini boom within the overall context of a bust. Of course, the mini boom fizzles in a year, 2 or 3, then the bust takes over. In other words, the reversal processes, which we started last time, all 5 overwhelm the government's reflationary process, and the bust begins to continue. Of course, the government sees again all the bad stuff, it reinflates again. Well, this is the story of Japan over the last 18 years. Every time deflation takes over, they reflate and engineer a short-lived boom, mini boom, which is more like a relief, and then the bust takes over. All right? Is this fairly clear? Any questions on the bust so far? No. 10 more minutes, a few more things. So, the question now becomes on prevention. In other words, busts are painful. A lot of bad consequences happen. People feel bad, impoverished, all terrible things. So, what do we do to prevent the bust? So, prevention, sometimes called prophylactics. So, what do you do in order to avoid the bust in the first place? Well, is the bust avoidable? No. The answer is certainly no, as long as you have allowed the boom to go on. There is one, and exactly one way to prevent a bust or a depression. Never let the boom in the first place. The problem is, once you get the boom, it must necessarily end up in a bust for the 5 fundamental reasons which I was explaining last time, all of them driven by undersaving. So, you allow the boom, undersaving occurs, the bust is guaranteed. If you don't want to get the bust, you should never let the boom occur in the first place. So, prevention is straightforward. No credit expansion in the first place. Well, then, suppose a boom began, and suppose you already got some malinvestments. The question is, how to make the bust the least painful? And the answer is, you must terminate the boom immediately in order not to allow further malinvestments and further maladjustments in the economy, and in order not to allow the temporal discoordination to continue. So, the best way to, alleviate the problems of a bust, once a bust is necessary, is to terminate the boom as soon as possible. If you terminate it as soon as possible, the bust will be the smallest, meaning the less painful. Then we have another question. You want the bust to be the least painful, then you should choose the stagflationary or the inflationary version. This is what governments typically do. But these two come at a tremendous cost. What is the cost of these two? Oh, well, all the problems of inflation, that one is clear, but there's a different problem with these two. These two are extremely lengthy in time. As the inflationary bust can last 5, 10, 15, 18 years and still counting today for Japan. It could literally doom a nation or an economy for 2 decades into weakness and poor economic health. In other words, it could make the economy permanently sick. The better solution, of course, is deflation. Deflation means that the depression is quick, vast, certainly extremely painful, but it's all over in a short period of time and the economy moves on. During the 19th century, you had 15 depressions, all of them deflationary in nature. Deflation is so vicious and so painful, and with all of these problems literally occur in a matter of a couple of months. 3-6 months, all of these hit the economy blows up, and 6 months later the economy is back to the next boom. So, deflationary busts, if you allow them to kick in, and if the government doesn't fight them, usually last barely 4 to 8 months. Extremely painful for a nation, but you're ready to move on, okay? Now, governments may choose 8 years instead of 8 months, but in other words, what is called, the term is spreading the pain, spreading the pain. In other words, certain things must happen, like the reallocation of resources and liquidations. Do you want to all have them at once in 4 months, or do you want to spread them out in 8 years? They must happen one way or another. Housing prices must fall relative to consumer prices one way or another. Do you want it to fall 70% in 4 months and move on, or do you want to let them fall for 17 years? In Japan, the Japanese have chosen real estate prices to fall 2% a year, not a big deal. But watching your house fall in price for 17 years in a row hurts big time. All right? Is that clear? Questions? Let's see what else I got. I got like 6 minutes and a few more things. Yes, what is the appropriate government policy? So I'm going to wipe this off and do some government policy. Alright, so number one, so policy. And when I say policy, I say appropriate policy. Now, this policy is what we call Austrian policy. And Austrian policy is diametrically opposite to modern, conventional, mainstream, New Keynesian policy. Diametrically opposite in every way. So, now you will understand perfectly both. It's kind of like looking at a coin from the one side and from the other side. Number one, do not liquidate. Don't prevent liquidations. In other words, within the Austrian framework and everything I've been teaching you in this course, liquidations are good. They shift the resources back to where they are most helpful. Within the mainstream framework, so let me draw a line here. Austrian mainstream. And remember, I promised you, for all of you that are going to be taking intermediate macroeconomics, you will get a healthy dose of a full semester of mainstream economics. So don't worry about it. Do not prevent. Here, mainstream says diametrically opposite. Do not reflect. What does reflation mean? Reflation means a premature abortion of the bust processes. If you just prematurely abort the bust process, this means that whatever is necessary to occur doesn't occur. So all that reflation does is slow the adjustment process down. And if you slow it down, it's going to take a whole lot longer. Well, at least logically, at least this is how many people would rather have it, is let's have it quick, let's have it painful, and move on. Now, mainstream says the exact opposite. Reflate the hell out of the economy. That's exactly what the US government is doing today. The inflation comes in the form of helicopter drops, right? How do they drop them? Well, government says we're going to send a total of $200 billion of checks. So the Fed, central bank, drops a helicopter of $200 billion to the federal government. And the federal government sends them as checks to, 200 million Americans. So they are effectively reflating the economy. Number 3, do not support wages. Do not support wages. Now, let's clarify why this is important. Remember, during the boom, wages or factor prices went up. And that was a distortion. So, wage falling is the way that the economy readjusts back to normal. So, the government should allow wages to fall. Remember, during the bust, you got an awful lot of unemployment. If you support wages, this means that the unemployment will remain high. If you get a lot of unemployment, there is one cure for it. Allow wages to fall in order to absorb the unemployed. Unemployment, meaning labor like any other commodity, if you get a surplus of it, there is one way to cure the surplus. You gotta let the price fall to cure the surplus, meaning to absorb it. So, do not support wages. Of course, here it is the exact opposite. Government does everything and anything possible to support wages. Number 4, do not support prices. So, do not support prices. Well, here's the thing. Now it has become somehow a top priority for US government macroeconomic policy, see how absurd it is, to support real estate prices. Because falling real estate prices would result in a disaster, according to the government. Well, what is the disaster if real estate prices fall in half? Well, a whole bunch of bankruptcies, a whole bunch of liquidations. So, there's nothing wrong with that, but at least the government says we must support real estate prices at all costs. Okay? So, this is exactly what governments do. So, here you get the exact opposite. according to Austrians, say, hey, let them fall and fall as fast as possible, as low as possible. This will reshuffle real estate back to normal people. It will bring back real estate to profitability. Of course, it will concentrate phenomenal losses in an extremely short period of time. But this is considered to be, for Austrians, better. Well, let them take $1 trillion of losses this year and make real estate profitable again next year, as opposed to keep real estate prices high and keep the industry unprofitable for a decade or more. Okay, is that one fairly clear? Next, do not stimulate consumption. Okay, do not stimulate consumption. How come? Why?
Because it will decrease savings.
Yes, because it will decrease savings. The problem in the first place is a shortage of savings. What the government should do is stimulate savings in every possible way, and at the same time try to dis-stimulate consumption. In other words, should try to do everything possible to reduce consumption in order to increase the pool of savings and allow whatever has been begun to be completed. Now, the government in modern day economics says, oh, there is not enough aggregate demand. So what we want to do is stimulate consumption as much as possible. Okay? If we just send everybody $5,000 checks, they're all going to go and spend it, and this will revitalize the economy. Alright? Well, what is wrong with that logic? Well, what is wrong is by sending to everybody 5,000 or 50,000 or 5 million is not going to actually drill an oil and find a well and find crude oil. You understand that? It is not going to fix the problem of malinvestment. It is not going to fix the interest rate problem. In other words, sending everybody a check to boost consumption isn't going to fix any of these problems. It isn't going to do anything for the bust except for making it worse, because it depletes already scarce savings. 5, 6. Do not subsidize unemployment. Again, the basic idea is that the government, somebody's unemployed, we're going to relieve your pain. Here's a $2,000 check, and now you don't have to worry about it. That's what subsidizing unemployment means. It means you're unemployed, government is subsidizing you. In other words, pays you some money not to work. Well, how is this going to fix the problem? Yes, it's not fixing anything. Of course, they say, oh, we're going to alleviate your pain. It's kind of like you're suffering from some big disease, you need a major operation, you know, the surgeon's got to cut deep, cut it out, throw it away, and stitch you back in, and instead the government says, here's some heroin, you're going to feel a lot of good about it, well, at least for a while, but the heroin just makes you feel good. Of course, it kills the pain, but the disease is there, and it's working, and it's getting worse, okay? And it is not a cure. You know, getting a really sick person who needs a major medical, probably surgical treatment, and just shooting the patient with heroin just makes him feel good, but it doesn't cure him, all right? Same thing with subsidizing unemployment. What you want to do is not subsidize unemployment so that wages actually fall, and if wages fall, again, employers will be hiring back. You want wages to fall as fast as possible and labor to become as cheap as possible so that employers will hire them back. Alright? You got to understand, if someone is unemployed, he's practically not producing anything. It is a pure waste of a productive resource. If better wages to fall so that that person contributes back with some output, whatever that output might be. 7. Do not prevent bank runs. Do not support or, prevent. This is classic. Here they say prevent at every cost. Well, of course, this one is also opposite. Prevent at every cost bank runs. Bank runs shake confidence, cause a whole bunch of trouble, people lose money, and all those things. So, what is the Austrian framework that we've studied so far? A bank run is a good thing. It keeps banks disciplined. It also keeps banks more honest. If you prevent bank runs, bankers do a whole bunch of bad things, as we find out now, right? Like Northern Rock, okay? So, bank runs are a good thing because bank runs have one special purpose. A bank run is extremely deflationary, and as such, it accelerates a deflationary bust. So, allowing most banks to fall is extremely deflationary, and if you let them fall in a matter of weeks or a month, in a couple of months, the bust is over. So, bank runs speed up the process of a bust. Well, governments typically, or the mainstream recipes, no way, no bank runs. And finally is something I already mentioned: encourage more savings. Interestingly enough, the mainstream policy is extremely absurd by discourage savings, which is encourage consumption. So, encourage savings, the modern recipe is discourage saving. Discourage saving is the same as encourage consumption. Why the philosophical difference? The philosophical difference is shockingly simple. Within Austrians, the original problem was overconsumption and undersaving. For the mainstream, the original problem is not enough aggregate demand and not enough consumption in the first place. Mainstream simply says, because there is not enough consumption, if we just stimulate aggregate demand by having everybody consume more, it will restore aggregate demand and therefore will bring the economy back to normal. If people are not willing to consume enough, the government will just spend more and consume more, and by consuming more, we'll fix the problem. Austrians say consumption does not bring prosperity. Consumption never creates value. Value is created by one and one way only: producing. And production comes out of capital and labor working together. And increased productivity comes only from one and one way for Austrians: investments. And investments are driven by savings. Let me see anything else. That's it, guys. I'm done for today. So you also got policy too.